Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Alex Cho with the National Council for Community and Education Partnerships. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join me on this webinar. Super excited to see many of you in New York City for the upcoming capacity building workshop. So if you're new to the Gear Up program, either as a new grantee or if you're relatively new to your role, I'm hoping that this webinar can help orient you to really the big picture of the Gear Up program so that your time in New York is as productive as it possibly could be. Or, you know, if you're just looking for a refresher and you're not even coming to New York City, this is a good time to get a sense of, you know, how your daily work is contributing to our national effort to increase the college and career readiness of students across the country. So before I jump in, let me tell you very quickly about myself. My name is Alex Cho. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations at the National Council for Community and Education Partnerships. We have a very long and unwieldy acronym. We're known as NCEP within the Beltway and among our community. And we are a national not-for-profit organization that was founded by the Ford and Kellogg Foundations right around the time that Gear Up was created. And our goal and mission is to build the capacity of communities so that underserved students across the country have the opportunity, skills, and knowledge to successfully pursue education beyond high school that will help them achieve their career and life goals. So we're super excited to be pretty deeply involved with the Gear Up community. We provide a ton of professional development to the Gear Up community. We provide a lot of direct technical assistance to grantee programs across the country. We have a host of national programs that you can learn about on our website. And then we also do a lot of things as it relates to ensuring that we have the research and evaluation infrastructure in place so that we can demonstrate our efficacy as a community. And then, of course, we do a lot in the public policy domain. And so, you know, we work with the Department of Education, the White House, and Congress to ensure that Gear Up and other programs that serve low-income students across the country get the attention that they deserve. So that's us in a nutshell. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to try to accomplish today in our webinar. One, I just want to ensure that new or newish Gear Up professionals across the country have some exposure to the big picture relative to the National Gear Up program. Specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rationale, the objectives, and the underlying theory of action for why Gear Up exists and what makes it such a powerful, impactful program. And then I want to make sure that I move pretty swiftly so that if you have any burning questions, we can go ahead and try to address those throughout this webinar. So just to orient you a little bit, we're all using a webinar software program. So if you do have a question, depending on if you've downloaded the GoToWebinar desktop software, you can type your question in the little question dialog box. Or if you were just using the web browser or your tablet, you can use on the online viewer, you can just click that little question button, and I will be alerted to your question, and I will do my best to answer it in kind. Okay, so what the heck is this Gear Up that everyone is talking about? I suspect that a healthy number of you all on this call who will be attending the capacity building workshop, you know, we're hired to provide a very specific role within the project, but you may not have a broader sense of what the program is all about. Maybe in some cases you're just getting on a plane because someone asked you to. That's totally okay. You're going to find yourself immersed in probably, at least in my opinion, the most generous and rewarding community of education professionals that you'll ever find. And they're all affiliated with this Gear Up program. So Gear Up is a federal program. It's highly competitive. It's national in scope, and it is a primary lever in our national strategy to improve college and career readiness for low-income students. When you think about the federal landscape of programs dedicated to that particular topic, it's actually a relatively small handful of programs, so Gear Up is one of them. So the acronym for Gear Up is onerous, but it's actually a pretty good one as far as government programs go. It kind of gets to the heart of what we're all about, gaining early awareness and readiness for undergraduate programs. So let me talk a little bit more about what the Gear Up program is all about. Let me start with the kind of foundational question, and that is, you know, why the heck does Gear Up even exist? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You know, as professionals, you all know this to be true in your local communities, but when Congress back in 1998 created the Gear Up program, they were trying to address a couple of issues. The first was, you know, as our economy, as our social network has evolved, increasingly Americans of all stripes recognize that some form of post-secondary education is becoming increasingly important to achieving our life and our career and our civic goals. Insofar as that to be, is generally pretty universally true regardless of income, and what we've known for a long time even is that low-income students have an incredibly high aspiration to pursue post-secondary education. However, there's a big disconnect between what our students want and their readiness for higher education. So as you know from the research, and it could be the ACT sourced research, it could be the College Board sourced research, it could be NAEP, etc. What we know is that there are some really profound disparities between students from low-income backgrounds and their higher-income peers relative to their academic readiness to succeed in higher education. That is, students from low-income backgrounds are far more likely to be placed in non-credit bearing courses or remedial or developmental education programs, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the consequences there. So one of the foundational pieces of Gear Up is that if all students have high aspirations, what is it we can do as a country to help them realize those aspirations so that they can achieve their post-secondary goals? And academic readiness is a huge focus of the Gear Up program. In addition to academic readiness, and this is especially true for low-income students, I think we all know from our own personal experiences and from those that we advise that the pathway to college is actually a pretty complicated maze. And what we mean by that is when you look at higher income and middle income families, having some exposure to individuals who have gone through the college process, everything from the college search to the college application and ultimately the college enrollment process, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made along that way, and making informed decisions is a huge component of Gear Up. So what Gear Up will do is help impart college knowledge to students and families across the country so that they're making the best decisions possible and making decisions around fit both academically, socially, and financially, so that when they do pursue higher education, they are on a path that is more likely to lead to success. I think what we all know to be true is that as complicated as the pathway to higher education is, low-income students are the least likely to have solid, well-informed knowledge about those very decisions we just discussed. And just as a couple of examples, low-income students, even though they're the most likely to benefit from federal financial aid or state aid, they're the least likely to know about it. Parents, I think pretty universally, but especially in low-income communities, pretty severely overestimate the cost of higher education, so therefore they're making decisions that aren't necessarily in their favor. So there are all of these access points to for programs like Gear Up and other programs to help strengthen the underlying knowledge base in students and schools and of course at home, so that things like financial aid awareness, the college application process, match and fit can all be structured in a way that is most beneficial to the individual needs of students. As one of the outcomes of some of these disparities between low income and their students and their higher income peers is that we actually see some pretty dramatic differences as it pertains to college enrollment. Now, the good news is that it is quite possible to move college enrollment numbers for low income students. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Gear Up does that. But if you were a member of Congress back in 1998 trying to conceptualize how you would design a program to accelerate college and career readiness, obviously college enrollment would be a key data point, one in which you would, spend a substantial amount of time and effort really thinking about, and that is how do you move the needle for low-income and middle-income students so that they are pursuing higher education at appropriate rates. Just like we see a gap between low-income and the students and their higher-income peers in terms of the enrollment, we actually see those gaps widen when it comes to things like college completion. And this is especially troubling because when we think about what motivated some members of Congress to contribute to the creation of the Gear Up program is that they were very much looking to revitalize communities for economic development, but at a more granular level, they were trying to change the trajectory of students relative to their ability to climb the economic ladder that has existed since post-World War II, and we know what the data say. The data say, some form of post-secondary education is the passport to success. Now, for low-income students, this is particularly, the gap in college completion is particularly disturbing because, low-income students, in many respects, have the most to gain with a college degree, and that is they are 5 times more likely to escape poverty with a college degree. Therefore, there's a big emphasis both at the state, national levels, for a very long time now, to invest in programs that help accelerate student success from low-income schools and communities as a means of improving the social and economic outcomes that we are confronted with in communities all over the country. And I think one of the key drivers for why we need Gear Up, and certainly, we see, this tends to be a key focal point in both, red and blue states or members of Congress who are Democrats or Republicans, is that, we just see this incredible disparity in terms of who's benefiting from the economy. And what we know is that since the Great Recession, about well over 95% of the new jobs that have been created has required some degree of post-secondary education, some exposure to post-secondary education, and the fact that so few, on a percentage basis, so few students who are participating in higher education are from low-income backgrounds really disadvantages them in the long term. So, okay. So we all know this stuff, right? I mean, we see this, we live this, we breathe this day in, day out. What the creation of the Gear Up program in 1998, the real opportunity that it presented was the opportunity to create a program that really unified 3 key dimensions in which we know from the research literature can help address some of those very significant challenges that I just described. So what Gear Up tries to do is it tries to bring a comprehensive, holistic approach to college readiness and preparation that at its foundation is about academic achievement. I'll talk a little bit more about the common types of programs that Gear Up provides, but you shouldn't be surprised that an overwhelming number of them are focused on helping to ensure that students have the academic foundation so that when they get to higher education, they won't struggle academically, which is, a key determinant. And if they're going to, return to school the next day, the next week, the next semester, or the next year. Secondly, Gear Up is all about academic aspirations, helping students and their families set higher goals for themselves relative to their education and career goals, but then also providing them with the college knowledge so that they can make really informed decisions across the entire pathway from the middle grades through higher education. So that is thinking about decisions that are made in middle school, how they affect, for example, the types of courses you take in high school, and then ultimately the very granular decisions related to the college search enrollment and the college search application and enrollment processes. On top of that, big emphasis on financial aid and some other key pieces that I'll get into momentarily. So this is what, at the heart and soul of Gear Up is kind of really bringing these 3 content domains together in a comprehensive and coherent way in your communities, in your schools, and in your interactions with individual students. I should say, although a lot of what I'm going to be talking about with Gear Up seems pretty mainstream today, seems very commonplace today, in fact, when this program was created in 1998, it was very unique, and in some respects, it was very radical for a federal program to be promoting these 3 dimensions. Okay, so let's talk specifically about how the Gear Up program improves college readiness and success. When Gear Up was created in 1998, the Congress wrote in 3 national objectives for Gear Up. The first is to improve or to increase the academic performance and preparation for post-secondary education among participating students. Right? We want more students to do better academically and be better prepared for higher education. Pretty straightforward. The second national objective is to increase the rate of high school graduation and participation in post-secondary education. So no surprise there. We want our students to complete high school, and we want them to enroll immediately into post-secondary education. And then lastly, and this was such a brilliant idea at the time, was this real heavy emphasis on helping to increase the educational expectations among students and their families as it relates to their underlying knowledge of the post-secondary education, what their options are, what steps they have to take to prepare for it, and then how to finance their higher education. So when you think about how members of Congress evaluate the overall impact of this program, they look at these dimensions, but I'll cut to the chase. They tend to focus on one big number, and that number is how well our Gear Up students are enrolling in higher education after they graduate high school. So what you're looking at here in this slide is just a little bit of context of the impact that Gear Up is having on the stated goal of increasing post-secondary enrollment among our students. In the orange bar to the right of the slide, you'll see that about, based in 2014, about 45.5% of low-income students nationally graduated from high school and immediately enrolled into college. And on the blue bars, you'll see to the left of that, you'll see how Gear Up students are performing. And, this is pretty striking. We're looking at, if you look at the 2014 number in particular, we're looking at a 30% differential between Gear Up students and non-Gear Up low-income students across the country. And even if you were to look at the 2011 number of 59.9%, that's an extraordinary number. We generally, at least in the policy context, we don't actually see that many dramatic swings in college enrollment through kind of the national lens. So when you hear from your fellow Gear Up folks who are, I say folks, but your leaders and your colleagues across the country who maybe through a previous grant has increased their college enrollment by 20% or more, something really extraordinary is happening. So let me talk a little bit about why we see those numbers change. So I talked a little bit about how competitive the Gear Up program is when I introduced what Gear Up was all about. And it's really the competitiveness of this program that where we start to see the genesis for why we're seeing impact. So Gear Up promotes student success by first and foremost the community leaders who are in charge of putting together their application to receive these federal grants. It's a pretty high performance bar that they need to meet. So it's not unusual for communities to spend a year or more developing a very data-driven application that to a great extent has diagnosed the root causes of whatever is preventing students in their community from pursuing higher education or succeeding in higher education. So this really comprehensive kind of diagnosis process really starts to illustrate what types of activities that the Gear Up program could supplement, local education practices, so that for a relatively modest investment, we could actually see the type of dramatic changes as it pertains to college enrollment that we've seen. And this is done through a couple of things that are quite common across the country. Every Gear Up program is focused on, very early, in helping students facilitate, taking and completing a rigorous college prep curriculum. Gear Up provides really intensive academic and social supports to both students and families. You'll see a deep degree of engagement with students and families around the value of education, and then it's really, Gear Up is all about providing a hand up. That is providing some one-on-one advising to help guide students and their families through the very, very complicated college search, application, and enrollment process. So it's the combination of these kind of major strategies that we see that success is quite possible and quite attainable, and Gear Up has got a pretty extraordinary track record in that regard. So let me talk a little bit about what makes Gear Up unique, and this is, really when push comes to shove, some of the very kind of radical ideas that Congress hit on in 1998. The first kind of crazy idea that they had was that, the Gear Up program actually lives in the Higher Education Act, so it lives in Title IV. Also in Title IV are the Pell Grant, the Federal Financial Aid System, and so forth. So what makes this unique is that it's a higher education program in which 99.9% of the activities take place in K-12. So what Gear Up requires is that it is very much by nature a holistic program that is rooted in early intervention. What I mean by that is every Gear Up program across the country is required to begin providing services to students no later than the 7th grade. Okay, so when we think about where Gear Up begins, it begins before that critical transition where students are moving from the middle school to the high school. So why the 7th grade? You know, I think we could all argue that college readiness begins much, much earlier. I certainly believe that to be true. But, you know, when push comes to shove, Congress said, you know what, there's a body of research that says students' academic aspirations really begin to firm up around the 8th grade. So let's reach out to students, let's teach them about higher education, let's expose them to their college and career options at a much earlier age, and hopefully you know, start to instill, help these students develop some important goals and make commitments to those goals prior to the 8th grade. The other thing that makes Gear Up really unique is that it provides typically whole grades of students with sustained programs. So we call this the cohort approach. And that is an entire grade level of 7th graders will receive Gear Up services and interventions, and those services will follow those students as they matriculate from the 7th grade through high school graduation, and even in many cases through the first year of post-secondary education. So, you know, the idea is that the programs evolve and they grow as the students mature over time. Gear Up is probably one of the most, and it's part of why it's so competitive and so difficult as a program to access, is that it really sets a very high standard in terms of requiring that communities apply research-based efforts or research-based practices to local efforts. So as I mentioned, the applications require very, very substantial analysis of what your local needs are and how you can better align your resources and your capacities towards these shared goals of success. And it also requires that we consistently collect data and monitor and improve our programs on an annual basis. So that's, you know, one of the big themes that you'll hear about if you're coming to New York City in a few weeks around the capacity building workshop, is virtually all of the sessions you'll be participating in is really organized around how do we get better, how do we improve, how do we become more impactful with our limited resources. The other key component to the Gear Up program is that the Gear Up programs, you know, the grant awards actually go to these really comprehensive community and education partnerships. You may, you know, from your vantage point be, oh, you know, I'm a Gear Up counselor or I'm a Gear Up coordinator in a school, therefore, you know, Gear Up is just, you know, something that's happening in my school. Actually, Gear Up is something that's happening at the community level. So what the legislation requires is that leadership from K-12, post-secondary, and community-based partners come together, commit to implementing a strategic plan relative to common goals that they jointly define. So in that regard, Gear Up is incredibly flexible, meaning it can work in, let's say, the South Bronx, but it can also work in, you know, rural, you know, Montana. Whatever your local needs are in the community, that's what you build your program around. And if the needs are so great that you can get the K-12 leadership and the post-secondary and CBOs to agree that this is a high, you know, the need is a high strategic value, well, they'll develop programs to address that. So that is a real core competency of the Gear Up community, is this notion of partnership that, you know, while, you know, an army of powerful professionals are implementing this work, that it's actually woven into this much broader kind of partnership tapestry around, you know, common needs and common goals. And then lastly, Gear Up is quite unique in the education space in that it requires a dollar-for-dollar match requirement. So what that means is for every dollar that the federal government provides to a community, they have to match it with one non-federal dollar, either provided you know, as a gift from participating members of the partnership or through in-kind contributions. So, you know, having faculty volunteer, have instructors and counselors at the school level volunteer time and effort towards pursuing the Gear Up program. So this is done for a couple of reasons. One, Congress wanted to ensure that, you know, the communities that received these Gear Up grants had skin in the game, and they wanted to make sure that these communities would take the investment that the federal government is making, take it very seriously, and immediately start to think about how do we start to institutionalize some of the innovations that the GEAR Up program can introduce into a school or a school district. So in many respects, when you think about the GEAR Up program, I encourage people to think about it like seed money, right? The federal government makes an investment in communities to rethink, redesign their strategies and their thinking towards college and career readiness, and provides them with the resources necessary to get those programs off the ground, refine them, improve them, and demonstrate that they work. And if they do work, everybody across the country is hoping that those programs are sustained. Now, sustainability is a huge, challenge in the GEAR Up community for sure, but we've seen extraordinary things happen in just about the 20 years that GEAR Up has been implemented. So we've seen school districts create strategic plans based off of their GEAR Up innovations that, incorporate the innovative programs that GEAR Up created have been kind of institutionalized district-wide. They've been replicated in other schools. They become the foundation for how districts are improving their work. I would also argue that if you look at the ESSA, the K-12 federal legislation, you actually see the fingerprints of GEAR Up all over the place. You see a much heavier emphasis on sustained intervention. You see a much heavier emphasis on community and education partnerships. And in many respects, the radical ideas that GEAR Up introduced in 1998 are becoming, kind of the preferred mainstream approach for, education reform relative to college readiness. So we're thrilled with that. As it pertains to the types of activities that GEAR Up implements, this is, largely a laundry list of research-based practices. So, I don't want to, get too far into the weeds on all of these things, but what I did want to do was just kind of call to your attention some of the common activities, and they're common enough that we see them in virtually all of the GEAR Up programs that exist around the country, and they're common because of, one, they're research-based, two, they tend to be cost-effective and things that folks can implement reasonably well. But then thirdly, they tend to be things that are supplemental to what maybe school districts that don't have, the same resources as maybe some of the wealthier districts across the country. They come in, GEAR Up comes in, provides these supplemental resources to do things that they've always wanted to do. So on the academic side, GEAR Up makes huge investments around professional development in both the instructional and the advising community, so teachers and counselors, et cetera. We see a lot of leadership development as a result to help cast the right frame for improving local education initiatives. We see a lot of work around curriculum development and alignment. We see the incorporation of huge numbers of supplemental academic offerings. So, academic programs, you don't have one in your school, GEAR Up can help bring those things, and we see that expressed in other places like dual enrollment. We've seen GEAR Up programs, bringing AP to schools for the first time or expanding their AP offerings, and increasingly we're seeing more and more GEAR Up investment in, excuse me, in early college models. At its heart, you see just, probably the biggest investment in GEAR Up is around kind of academic advising, mentoring, and tutoring. You'll meet so many advisors who are working with students on a one-on-one basis when you get to New York. So this is a huge focus of our efforts. And bridge and transition programs. So we see these a lot, particularly as it pertains to the transition from middle school to high school and the transition from high school to post-secondary education. Under that kind of bucket around aspirations, some of the most interesting work that you'll see, or maybe some of the most inspiring work, I should say, is around everything that GEAR Up is doing around student-family engagement. So really bringing content expertise, really well-facilitated meetings, really helping to build the capacity of communities and families to be engaged not only in their students' education, but to get them inspired and fired up for higher education. It's so rewarding to see. GEAR Up spends a lot of time and effort around college visits and tours. I'm sure that's something that almost all of you guys are aware of. And one thing that we've learned interacting with our Gear Up alumni is when you ask them, hey, what was your favorite thing about the Gear Up program? It's not uncommon for them to say, it was the time that Gear Up took me to college X, Y, or Z, and that was the first time I could see myself on a college campus. So a really, really important strand of work. In addition, career counseling, mentoring, and internships, whole host of activities around leadership, service learning, and motivational programs. Probably over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot of Gear Up programs really focusing on helping to cultivate kind of the broader suite of skills that students need to succeed. So things that you would categorize under, grit or the non-cognitive domain, where we help to augment the academic skills with the non-academic. And then particularly on the state side, you'll see a lot of Gear Up programs offering Gear Up scholarships and awards. Under the college knowledge domain, virtually every Gear Up program has thought about systemic approaches for creating college-going cultures in schools. So helping, and this goes well beyond, putting up motivational posters or, having college tours and things like that, as important as they are. Gear Up programs are really charged with how do we help ensure that everybody in the school is expecting more of our Gear Up students as it relates to their college aspirations. A lot of direct support for the college search application enrollment process, a huge degree of advising and mentoring around college admissions, SAT, ACT prep, and helping students do everything around writing their essay, picking the schools that fit. And then one of the mandatory requirements of Gear Up is that it is required by law that each Gear Up program identify strategies that will help build the financial literacy of students and families, but specifically ensure that students are completing the FAFSA. So that is, one of the hallmarks of Gear Up is how successful our national community has been in ensuring that students and families are completing the FAFSA, understand the federal financial aid infrastructure, the state aid infrastructure, and so forth, and pursue scholarships and all that good work. And then another huge figure in terms of our work is just around kind of the partnership, right? If you require that school systems on the K-12 side and institutions of higher education and state agencies and business and civic leaders come together to identify these kind of strategic approaches to college career readiness, it takes a lot of time to nurture and develop those partnerships. And our goal is that we can develop a shared agenda and action plan for communities to increase college enrollment in a way that is sustainable. So you'll hear at our events, you'll hear when you interact with other Gear Up programs and so forth, a focus not only on the programmatic, but then also with an eye on kind of nurturing this culture of sustainability among our community, so that the work has an impact on students and families even when the federal grants come to an end, right? So that is our goal. So in addition to all of those things, and as important as research-based practices are, I think what you guys will learn, throughout your own experience is that when we talk to students, and we talk to a lot of Gear Up alumni pretty regularly, and we ask them, tell us about Gear Up, they actually don't tell us about the program. They don't even know it's a program. They tell us about Mr. Smith or Mrs. Johnson, who were Gear Up staff who worked with them so diligently to help them make it from the middle grades through high school graduation into college. And that speaks to the reality that, all of the strategies, it's all well and good, but, Gear Up is really about people. It's about leadership, and above all, it's about the relationships. So just ensuring that caring adults are well positioned to advise and support students and families who would otherwise not have these services is the most fundamentally important aspect of the Gear Up program. So we thank you for all the great work that you do, or all the great work that you will be doing in the upcoming year to help ensure that that Gear Up works in your community. So let me share with you a couple of things just about how the GEAR Up program is administered, just so that you have a much bigger sense of how the program operates. So, at its heart, the GEAR Up program is a federal program which is, essentially about investing in these seed grants. So what happens is the Congress on an annual basis works with the administration to determine an allocation for the GEAR Up program each and every year. They appropriate those funds to the U.S. Department of Education. Last year we were funded at $322 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but in the big picture it's a drop in the bucket and certainly not enough to meet the needs of communities all over the country. And then what happens is that the U.S. Department of Education takes that appropriation and they host a grant competition. So they invite communities in states all across the country to submit applications. They convene peer reviewers to carefully review and critique each of those applications. They score them, and based on kind of a roster and based on your score, they make awards. Once the award is made, the U.S. Department of Education is required to provide oversight and accountability to the program. So from there, the awards are actually made to what is known in the law as a GEAR Up fiscal agent, right? So every GEAR Up program has either a school district, an institution of higher education, or a state agency that has been designated as the group that is fundamentally accountable for the success of the program. So those folks, during the application process, they were leading the design process to get that strategic plan together. They apply for the grant and they manage the overall resources. They provide leadership and oversight to project implementation, and they provide capacity building, technical support, and partnership management. Okay. From there, once the fiscal agent, right, the school district or university or college or a state agency, once they receive that grant, they've identified a series of schools. These schools all have a couple of things in common. I'll get to that in just a second. And they've identified schools in which the programs are going to take place. So the flow of resources go from the fiscal agent to these partner schools, and that's where they manage their portion of the GEAR Up program. So they're implementing comprehensive programs and interventions in schools, K-12 schools all over your community, and they are also responsible for collecting and reporting on student, school, and district level data. So before I move on very quick, to the next topic, let me just say this. Ensuring that this feedback loop is effective, meaning Congress demands that the U.S. Department of Education is accountable for this program. Therefore, the U.S. Department of Education requires that our fiscal agents are accountable for this program, which in turn, the fiscal agents ask our partner schools and our professionals who are participating to provide, and I'm going to try to put this kindly, to provide a little bit more paperwork than you would typically expect. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, the Department of Education requires that each of our GEAR Up programs and each of our GEAR Up awards, in exchange for federal funds, provide a lot of oversight relative to fiscal management. So you'll see time and effort forms that are incredibly complicated, all of those things. Just know that that's a requirement that the Department of Ed and Congress has provided. You'll see that you'll probably be filling out a lot of paperwork relative to tracking student or family participation in programs, like literally documenting every activity that's happening. That is a requirement of the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education has an annual reporting infrastructure in which data comes in from all of our GEAR Up grantees, gets aggregated at the national level, and gets reported to Congress. And that's the basis by which Congress continues to fund the GEAR Up program year after year after year. And then lastly, another kind of big administrative demand of the GEAR Up program is that dollar-for-dollar match requirement. So, if you're working with Gear Up, you've probably been asked and it's probably driven you crazy, right? That you got to fill out these match forms all the time, or you've got to, identify, how much time and effort you spent working on Gear Up programs in an in-kind basis. And that is to ensure that your grant is in compliance with that dollar-for-dollar requirement. So the challenge here is that these resources that the federal government provides to communities, it is so rare, it is so precious, and it is so few. The fact that your community has one is a reflection of the extraordinary planning effort that they put into place. It is a reflection of the very robust and sound strategic plan that peer reviewers have said, hey, what this community is doing is worth investing in. And in exchange for those resources, which enables all of these great services to students, the federal government does require all of this paperwork that is, above and beyond kind of your typical day job, right? So as you are confronted with these match forms, as you're confronted with the time and effort forms, as you're confronted with the data collection forms, all of those things, just know that this was, it's not your boss's idea. This, this is not probably the most efficient way, to run your daily business, right? Having to set aside time every day to do this kind of thorough documentation, but it is an absolute requirement of being a sound steward of federal resources. So please be sympathetic to the extent possible and please comply as much as you can. All right, so I'll get off my soapbox there and let's talk about the two types of programs that Gear Up enables. So there are two types of programs and they run side by side. The first program, they're called state grants. Right, so these are competitive grants, meaning they're not formula-based. You don't just get a grant because you're a state, right? You have to apply for it and you compete against other states. And these are grants that are either 6 years or 7 years in duration. And if you choose that 7th year, you're committing to serving students in the first year of post-secondary education. Now, the state grant is awarded to an organization that has been kind of identified by the governor, so not just any entity can apply for a state grant. So that entity, they typically are state agencies, either on the higher education state agency or the loan guarantor company in the state or the K-12 agency or a system of higher education in the state. States are required to provide scholarships to Gear Up students. So basically they make a commitment to students who participate in the Gear Up program that upon high school graduation, they will provide a very modest scholarship to help offset the cost of their first year of college. Or if you reside in a state, I know many of your states have pretty robust state aid programs like a lottery scholarship or other means. You can obtain a waiver to not have to offer Gear Up scholarships, and you can reallocate those resources to services and interventions. So what makes the state program pretty unique is that they have some design options. So for example, they can provide early intervention and services to entire classes of students, what I'd mentioned earlier as being those cohort students, or alternatively, they can implement a model that's called a priority student model. And in that model, they identify students, not by classes and not based on characteristics of their school, but based on individual characteristics of those students. So for example, I see someone on the call made a note that they're from Kansas, and one of the phenomenal thing that Kansas does is that they've really focused, they've made a profound commitment and focus of providing Gear Up services to foster care students throughout the entire state. It is an extraordinary model. We should do, we'll schedule a whole webinar just to teach you what they're doing with that population. But the priority model gives them some flexibility to identify certain characteristics around students that are based on either need or they're, students who are considered to be highly disengaged. And then it allows the state to service that population, a little bit more freely than the cohort model would. State grants are capped on an annual basis, so state grants in 2014 are limited to $3.5 million per year for 6 or 7 years. So these are, depending on your lens, when you think about a state like California, $3.5 million probably wouldn't go very far when you think about, the profound needs of the students throughout the state. So it does require that our leadership really think about how can we take these modest investments and really maximize the impact. On the flip side, there's partnership grants, and these are competitive. These are super competitive, I should say. On the state side, you're only competing against other states, so just the limited universe of entities that are eligible. The individual states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and our federated territories are only eligible. States only compete against states. On the partnership grant side, any community can apply that meets the eligibility criteria. So we're talking, a massive universe of school districts or communities that can apply. And as a result, for those communities that commit to that year of planning and put in a ton of time and effort around developing a successful proposal, we only see like less than 1 in 5 applicants get funded. So this is in our view, our biggest challenge is how do we grow the GEAR Up program so that these empowered communities have the necessary resources to get the job done. So these partnership grants are awarded either to a school district or to an institution of higher education. Typically, a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution identified in the state. It provides specific early intervention services to entire cohorts of students, and they do it in specific feeder patterns. So they think about not only the middle schools where these students reside, but the high schools that these students will be matriculating to within the next number of years. And these partnership grants do not have the flexibility to implement the priority approach that I just described. Now, these partnership budgets are a little different in that there's not an annual cap, but Congress did institute an $800 per student annual budget. So if you are a partnership grant, you calculate the number of students that you're going to serve, and your budget request cannot exceed $800 per student served. We actually see that number actually much lower. It's much closer to $550 per year. So these are very, very modest results, and relative to the impact that we saw around college enrollment, a very, very good investment from, I think, any basic return on investment viewpoint. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about where we are in GEAR Up. In 2017, in the current academic year, we estimate that we're serving about 635,000 students across the country. On the state grant side, we have 42 state grants that are active. We just welcomed 5 new states to the GEAR Up community last fall. And of the overall kind of $322 million appropriations, about $159 million of that are going to these state grantees. You'll see that the average continuation award is a little higher than that $3.5 million that I described earlier. It's because in prior years they had a higher per state average that was $5 million. So we do have a couple of grantees that are closer to $5 million to that 3.5. On the partnership side, we have 92 grantees across the country. This past fall, we welcomed 5 new awardees to the community, and of the $322 million, $163.7 million is going to support these partnership grants. And you'll see that we're averaging about $1.8 million per year for 6 or 7 years on those partnership grants. So, depending on your perspective, either that's a lot of money or not very much money at all. I tend to be in that second group, right? I think investing $500 per year to see the types of outcomes that we're seeing, I think GEAR Up is a bargain as a taxpayer. Okay, so just to kind of illustrate where you'll see our GEAR Up community, what we've done here in this slide is to highlight 2 things. One, wherever you see a blue block, you see 1 fiscal agent for the GEAR Up program. Now, unfortunately, some of these communities are so tightly packed that you don't get a great scope. So, for example, in Chicago, there are multiple grants and so forth, and in Southern California, there are multiple grants that are kind of overlaying one another in Los Angeles and so forth. But what's striking here is 2 things. One, just kind of the distribution of GEAR Up fiscal agents, across the country. I mean, we love to say that Gear Up works everywhere. It works in the rural communities, it works in the inner city, it works in red states, it works in blue states. It works anywhere where leadership is committed to implementing a really comprehensive strategic plan. I should apologize to any colleagues on the phone from Hawaii. I just couldn't fit you in on the slide, but yeah, Gear Up is all over the multiple islands in the great state of Hawaii. And in green, you'll see the shades of green kind of correlate with the proportion of the Gear Up resources that are going to any particular state. So it should be no surprise that California and Texas and are receiving in New York, I should say, are receiving relatively high proportion of Gear Up funds, just based on their population, based on high enrollment of low-income students, just the sheer number of them. But you'll also see places like Washington, where the state, the leadership at the state agency and at institutions across that state, they've been incredibly active in pursuing, and they've been incredibly successful in succeeding in winning Gear Up awards. So our goal is to see, over time, our goal is we've been calling it the March to the 1 million. So we'd love to see 1 million students served by the Gear Up program. I'd like to see Gear Up, obviously, in every state that's eligible, and as many communities that have the fortitude to put together a successful proposal. We want to create the opportunity for them to access these funds. Okay, so thank you so much. I apologize. I hope that overview of the program wasn't too painful. I did receive a handful of questions, so please feel free to fire away with some questions if you have any burning questions. So let me start with what I got so far, and there seems to be a pretty clear consensus on one issue, so I'll certainly address that. But let me start picking off some of these other questions. Joe from Kansas asked, is there any data on graduation? And I suspect there are two areas in which graduation, so I need to be a little bit more specific about the question that's being posed, so I'll answer both questions. On high school graduation, we do have some data. The U.S. Department of Education collects it and reports it to Congress each and every year. Gear Up students are graduating from high school at really, really good rates, and it's improved over time. It just gets washed, it probably just gets lost in the wash that graduation rates across the board in states all over the country have gone up pretty substantially over the past decade, so it's just kind of good news all around. If I understand Joe's question correctly, I suspect that what Joe is asking is, do we have any data around post-secondary completion? So the answer to that is very, very limited. Unfortunately, the Gear Up program, since it only lasts from 6 or 7 years, and is required that you start serving students no later than the 7th grade for the majority of programs, by the time students graduate from college, the grant has been over for a number of years, and we just don't have the data infrastructure in place to track, all of the different students, which institutions they're going to attend, and what percentage of them or what number of them have graduated within, let's say, 6 years. We are doing a lot to try to rectify that. And you can go to the NSAP website to learn about an initiative that we have around creating a multi-state consortium that are doing exactly what Joe is talking about here, and that is creating a data infrastructure so that we can use data from the National Student Clearinghouse to, over time, look at how well Gear Up students are performing in the post-secondary level, even when the grants expire. So it's a really, really exciting initiative. We do have some evidence from some states and some partnership grants that have used, that have conducted their own evaluation, that have tracked students over time. And we've also looked at a cohort of students that were captured in an NCES data set. And when it comes to post-secondary completion, it appears, I don't have the richest data set to draw from, but on the limited data that we have, Gear Up students are doing really, really well when it comes to post-secondary completion, especially in the context of how low-income students are doing as well. check out our website around the consortium that I just described to learn a little bit more about how we're going to approach that. And if you guys have an interest in tracking how your students are doing, certainly talk to your program director, your Gear Up director on how to do that really, really well. Okay, I got a question about with the state grant, is each student in the scholarship in the program provided with a scholarship? The answer is yes and no. As I mentioned, state grants are required to provide a scholarship to participating Gear Up students. However, states have the option to opt out of the Gear Up scholarship altogether. So if they have opted out of the Gear Up scholarship, and the only reason they can opt out is because they have demonstrated that the state has a robust enough state aid policy that there's really no need for a kind of a modest Gear Up program. So for example, if your state has a lottery scholarship or has a pretty robust aid program, you can just waiver out and use those funds for programming. In those states, you are not required to provide a scholarship. If your state is a Gear Up state that provides quote-unquote Gear Up scholarships, the legislation does require that any student that was identified as a Gear Up student in year 1 of your program is required to receive a scholarship that is at least the amount of the minimum Pell Grant, around $600 during their first year of post-secondary education. And then they have a little bit of flexibility to reallocate those awards after year 1 based on how the state has a plan. So if you have a question about your own state Gear Up scholarship, the most important resource that you can reach out to is I'd reach out to the Gear Up staff at the fiscal agent, either at the institution or the state agency that's running your program, and they can provide you with tons of details on who is and who isn't eligible for Gear Up scholarships in your particular state, because there are a little bit of design features. Can a state priority model start with 9th graders? It can, and state priority models are distinctive for being so flexible that you can actually have some differing start dates based on where your students have. Based on where your student needs are at that time. So there's really no rule of thumb that I can think of in trying to describe a Gear Up priority model. They are all so unique, they are all so distinctive that probably if you want to learn more about how your program is working is reach out directly to your colleagues at the Gear Up program office, and they can tell you all about how their student service model is defined. Okay. I think I have time for just one question because it's going to take me a little bit of time, but I think I was asked this about 10 or 15 times, so I thought I would just go ahead and address this at the end. And the general thrust of the question is, what does the prospect of Gear Up look like under the new administration and under the new Congress? As you know, as you all are very well aware, we are in a context for the very first time in which there's a single political party that's in control of the House, the Senate, the administration, and we have been lucky, and it's certainly not dumb luck. We've been working very, very hard for almost 20 years now to ensure that Gear Up is a program that is supported in a very bipartisan way. So when you look at the history of the Gear Up programs, we've had so many different champions in Congress that are Democrats, that are Republicans, that we've been able to navigate some very complicated budget years. And in fact, there were a couple of years in the 2000s in which the Gear Up was targeted for elimination by the White House, and our advocacy efforts as a community with the Congress, we were able to overcome those proposed cuts, and Gear Up, in fact, did really well during those years. So my prognosis is this. There's a lot of uncertainty on obviously what federal funding is going to look like in education, but what I do know is that we have, when I think about the most important audience relative to the decision on is Gear Up going to be funded into the future or not, if you forced me to pick a group that was most influential, it would actually be the appropriation committees in the House and the Senate. So for example, the White House can propose a budget in which programs like Gear Up or any other education program is You know, they would propose either cutting it or reducing it or eliminating it altogether. However, the actual funding is controlled by Congress. The president can veto later if need be. And so in the end, the most important group are the folks, the individuals who make up the appropriation committees in the House and Senate. So let me just assure everybody this. We, regardless of the outcome of the election, we knew that we had to prepare for the context that we are currently in. So we have been working very, very hard to ensure that Republican appropriators are on board with the GEAR Up program. And what we, the results have been great. In fact, if you were to ask me the most important, maybe the top 3 most important reasons why GEAR Up has survived a wave of cuts in federal education funding over the last several years, and why GEAR Up has in fact seen increases when other programs were being level funded or cut, it's because we have such strong Republican support for the program in those appropriation committees and more broadly. The message that GEAR Up is a hand up, not a handout, is one that really resonates. The fact that it is so flexible and empowers local leaders to design interventions and programs and strategies that meet the unique needs, meaning, this works in rural communities, inner cities, you name it. And whatever your needs are, GEAR Up is flexible enough to help you achieve your goals. And the fact that it is so interconnected between kind of the 2 major thrusts of higher education policy, and that is, 1, opportunity for students, right, particularly from low-income backgrounds. I mean, GEAR Up speaks to that directly, but it's also all about ensuring that we have programs in place that are strengthening our communities relative to economic development, that's strengthening access to careers and productive jobs, all of those things. Those are messages that really resonate very well, no matter what side of the aisle that you're on. My prognosis for GEAR Up is quite positive for at least the next 2 years. We'll see how the budget kind of evolves over time. But one of the key things that we do is we every time we get a chance to come together, we work very closely, and what we try to do is help empower GEAR Up leaders, GEAR Up stakeholders, GEAR Up students. We try to help them find their voice in the advocacy domain so that they can communicate to Congress how important these resources are for improving the quality of education in their schools, the quality of life in their communities, and for creating opportunities for students and families who are willing to put in the hard work to earn that opportunity. So we're feeling pretty good. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail at the event. We'll give a much deeper prognosis, but just keep doing what you're doing. Keep focused on the daily work of making GEAR Up a success, and as long as we can continue to demonstrate that GEAR Up works, meaning that for every investment we make in a community, that we see a return on that investment, I think GEAR Up is in a position to thrive over the next several years. So with that, I do see a handful of other questions. I apologize, we've just kind of run over on time, and I just want to make sure that I'm not keeping you guys too long. So a couple of quick questions that I'll hit real fast. Someone makes the observation that, yeah, monitoring or tracking college completion seems to be very, very important. We should do something about that. You are absolutely correct. As part of our reauthorization proposal, which is we are recommending to Congress that when they reauthorize the GEAR Up program, we've included new provisions that would allow every grantee at their discretion to create the data agreements and create the data infrastructure so that they can monitor how well students are doing at the post-secondary level, even beyond the life of their grant. So I'm with you there, and we're working with Congress on that. And then lastly, can you clarify how a student is identified as a GEAR Up student as opposed to a GEAR Up school that is a GEAR Up? So typically, on the partnership grant side, any student who is part of that original 7th grade cohort is considered a GEAR Up student, regardless if they choose to participate in programs or not. I mean, in many of these programs you opt into, obviously. You can't kick down their door at home, I suppose. to deliver intervention. So those students are identified if they're part of a class, regardless of income, regardless of, if the school has been designated as being a Gear Up school based on overall free and reduced lunch enrollment. And if you're part of that 7th grade class, you're a Gear Up student. On the priority side, it's a little bit more complicated. On the state side, states can define who is a priority student, and they do that based on a number of criteria. The first being typically around income. Are they free and reduced lunch? 2, do they have extraordinary needs relative to being a foster student, or are they homeless? Do they reside in public housing? And then they are also given the opportunity to define their own criteria for designating a student as being quote-unquote highly disengaged. And that's essentially a flexible mechanism for states to identify students with particular traits that could really benefit from the one-on-one interventions that their state could provide, and therefore each state has their own definition for a priority student. So it's a little tougher for me to paint a national portrait there, so definitely reach out to your program leaders to get the skinny, and they should be able to provide you with all the details as necessary. Okay, so with that said, I apologize for keeping you a little over. Please feel free to contact me anytime. Here's my phone number, here's my email address. You should also follow us on Twitter. We share all kinds of cool updates on what's happening in Gear Up all across the country. It's a very kind of inspirational type Twitter feed, so it's a lot of fun. And if you have any questions, please don't be shy. If you're going to New York, please say hello. I'll be around at the conference. I'll be hanging out in hallways and so forth. Be sure to introduce yourself. I'd love to learn more about your work. So thanks, everybody. And for those of you going to New York, bring your winter coats and safe travels. Anyone else? Keep up the good work. We appreciate everything you do. So with that, I'm going to conclude the webinar, and thanks, everybody.